Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Sam. I am thrilled that you're joining me today. I will warn you, today we have one of the most iconic guests that I've ever had who has not been in a while, and his name is Michael Webb. He is a hero of mine, a brother of mine. I'm honored to have him in my life. I think incredibly highly of him, and I've sent many people, friends, colleagues, whatever to you. And so, man, it's so good to have you back in the podcast. How are you?
Thank you, Sam. I really appreciate that. Doing pretty good today. Kind of always nervous to get on camera, but that's just, kind of a self-centered fear as if I'm supposed to be anything other than me here.
I'll never forget the day you said something. I've said it to people for so long is I got to be me for me. And that's not arrogance. That's confidence. But you only come to a point where you say, I got to be me for me when you've tried to be me for everybody else and it hasn't worked. So when you finally come to that conclusion, and we're already starting off, I got to hold on because you always make me go deeper in my thoughts. And so for those who are new to the podcast, new to my channel, why don't you share just a little bit about your history, what you do, what you specialize in, all that fun stuff.
Well, I office in Keller in Flower Mound, Texas. I've been in the field for about 25 years. Started out in addiction treatment, worked in addiction for about 10 years. I'm a counselor supervisor and train LPCs and LCDCs that are interns and getting into the field. For the last probably 13 or 14 years, I have focused on trauma, specifically developmental trauma or complex trauma and complex grief, which essentially comes down to PTSD. Complex trauma is trauma that occurred during our development and subsequently shaped our development and sometimes shaped our ideas about who we are, which leads to complications later on in life with relationships, with intimacy, sometimes with addiction, emotional regulation. It can crop up in lots of different ways. Fortunately, it's not something we have to live with forever, that there is hope, there is help.
You're exactly right. Today's going to look a little bit different for those of you that have followed me for a long period of time. We are going to talk about infidelity or addiction, but we're going to be under the banner of trauma. And whether you're dealing with the trauma of betrayal trauma, or you are an unfaithful and you've traumatized your own life, or perhaps you have childhood sexual abuse, you're working and navigating through childhood trauma. Today's going to be a conversation with Michael, almost as if it was a session where we're talking through some things that, regardless of where you're at, betrayed, unfaithful, 2 months out, 2 decades out, maybe you have stumbled upon the podcast because you want to have a better understanding of your own childhood trauma. There's nobody better that I could introduce you to than Michael Webb. And so, Michael, you and I talk often about powerlessness. And you said something to me one day that was brilliant. You said powerlessness interferes with what we think we need. What the hell? Why does that happen?
Well, I guess you should start with that there's so many things in life we cannot control. And if you believe that there is some spiritual guide that's kind of governing things, or at least riding herd on the world and on reality, believing that I need something that I cannot control puts me in a place of fear. That I'm going to be at least a little bit anxious about, I can't control whether or not I'm going to get what I need. And frequently, or especially in terms of relationships and our emotions, we believe we need something because we don't know how to do without it. Like in the case of addiction, we believe we may need the substance or the process, like gambling, sex, food, work.
Affair partners.
Affair partners, yes. We may believe that we need it in order to function. The reality is, underneath that addiction or that compulsion, we have an unmet need that is real, that is genuine, maybe for intimacy or connection, or an ability to love ourselves, ability to appreciate ourselves. There may be a part of us trapped in a painful and frightening moment that is intolerable. And anytime that moment is triggered, we re-experience the emotions that we had at the time. And only that substance or that person or that process seems to alleviate that fear and pain. And so we believe we need it. And we want to control the supply, if you will, of what we need. However, what we really need is to resolve that inner conflict, that pain, that trauma. If we're able to come to some resolution about that, develop coping skills, we no longer need what we thought we needed.
Because it's a well-known fact, you say this, when we have trauma in our past, our childhood, or what have you, when a trigger comes along, maybe it is betrayal trauma, but when a trigger comes along, isn't it true that trauma says it's happening now? It may have been a year ago. It may have been 2, 3, 4 years ago. But the brain, the nervous system goes, it's happening now, it's happening now. And so then we experience symptoms as though we are right when it happened. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. Trauma, in some perspectives, is a memory problem. Everything that happens in our brain happens now. I mean, we only have now in terms of any experience we're having. With trauma, though, it's very different. That if I burn my hand on the stove when I'm 5 years old and mom comes over and says, don't touch the stove now, and then puts some ice on it, kisses my boo-boo, I feel better. I'll remember that moment as being cared for, and also don't touch the damn stove. However, if it was a traumatically stored memory, say mom says, well, that's what you get, dumbass. Next time, don't touch the freaking stove. Now get out of the kitchen. And I walk away with my hand burning, and I'm also feel rejected and judged and maybe worthless, and it was my fault. Well, maybe a 5-year-old can't process that in the moment. And so it's stored in its raw form. And then if I happen to burn my hand on the stove, or for that matter, if it's really close to the surface, whenever I go to cook, I might feel this pang of anxiety. And if it's a full-blown trigger, I may even feel my hand burn. And I re-experience that experience because it's not processed. So I can remember getting hurt if it's a memory. If it's PTSD, I re-experience the pain.
Okay, there we go. We're off and running. So my good buddy James, who I host Ask the Unfaithful with, he made a good point. And I know that you agree, but there is an assumption when you discover infidelity, there is an assumption by some pretty elite clinicians, yourself included, that that person has PTSD. That's how disturbing it is to just assume that they have PTSD. So let's stay on the vein of PTSD. What if they don't have thousands of dollars to do all of these different things? I mean, they can feel like they are stuck in this type of cycle, right? And so how do they work through it when we use the filter of what you're talking about, which is this is trauma. It's happening like it's now. And then we, the unfaithful, sit back and go, dude, that was so long ago. Why do we have to keep doing this? And then unfortunately, we shame them, we demean them, we degrade them, we do all kinds of things, but really, we're kind of being a big ass because we don't understand the impact of trauma, right?
Yeah. If for me, it was 5 years ago, and, I admitted it. It sucked. I'm sorry. I haven't done it since. Can't we get past this? However, the betrayed spouse, every time something triggers that memory of discovering that there was infidelity, they re-experience the pain of it, the fear of it, the insecurity, sometimes even the shame that can come along with being betrayed. And they're re-experiencing, just like my hand burning because of the stove that I didn't process. It's like it happened today. It's happening
Yeah.
right now. And as a result, the emotional disturbance happens right now. It may appear like, I am not present in the moment, because in the moment we've talked about it. I've apologized. I've made changes. I've become very transparent. All good. However, if the betrayed spouse hasn't processed the pain of it, then they're going to be re-experiencing it, and it's going to be like it was 5 years ago.
And there's this point where, okay, they do the work and they start to move through it. They find an expert, they process through it. But then they come to a point maybe where oftentimes the betrayed feels like, look, I can't get my partner to do the work that I want he or she to do. I can't get them to pursue me. I can't get them to do whatever. There is that feeling of powerlessness. And powerlessness means I'm human. But to control freaks like me, powerlessness is the enemy, because I'm going to find a way to exhibit my power and influence and really make things worse. So when we hit this point of powerlessness, maybe we have a spouse that doesn't understand our childhood sexual abuse, and they're trying to help us, and they have to hit a point of powerless, or they have to hit a point of embracing powerlessness. So I want to transition to this concept, because I think it's really so powerful when we can learn some of the truths that you help clients learn. Is it that powerlessness just sucks and that we just love to be control freaks? Is it that it's scary? I mean, what are some thoughts on why we hate powerlessness?
So if I don't have any power, I don't have any control. And when we're talking about something that is as sensitive and powerful as love and attachment, marriage, not feeling that I have control, the next thing I grab for is influence. In a just world, if somebody makes vows to me and we've combined our lives, I should have some influence over what that person does, what they say, and they have influence over me. And so if I'm in distress, it seems fair that my partner would move to help me, to comfort me.
Right.
But sometimes they don't know how. Sometimes they're up against something within themselves, like shame or guilt or denial, that they're not able to respond. At other times, they're responding all over the place. However, the betrayal itself has led me to not trust the person that's trying to comfort me.
Mm.
Like you said all that before when you were covering up the affair. So how am I supposed to believe it now if I didn't believe it then? So there's powerlessness. There's a lack of control and influence on both sides of this conversation. The unfaithful spouse may well have done their work and are trying very hard to reestablish trust and strengthen the marriage. However, the betrayed spouse may be feeling as though they can't trust the change.
Right.
Because they can't trust the change, psychologically, it doesn't make sense to me to give up the trauma of the betrayal, the resentment, the distrust. If I give it up, then I'm going to become open. I'm going to become vulnerable again. And why would a reasonable person do that if I'm not feeling like it's safe?
That's exactly right. So where do you take them?
So to some degree, this kind of situation also occurs because there's other things going on. And so talking through the situation, it may be that the betrayed spouse has been betrayed before in childhood, in middle school, in high school. And that betrayal, it may not have been processed. They may have actually developed a fear of intimacy that has been there the whole time. And maybe they've worked around it in one way or another, like through the bonds of marriage.
Right.
Maybe through control that their spouse has allowed to happen. Because we can't really control another person. We just can't. They
Right.
may do what we ask them to do, but it's their choice to ask, to do it. They can say no.
And we can have boundaries, we can have expectations, but at the end of the day, we can't make them want to do those things. And that pushes us to a point of either anger and insanity and frustration or powerlessness, which, right, that there's an understanding that if we can't do anything about it per se, we can't do anything about what they're going to do, we begin to really waste time and energy and actually even harm ourselves, right?
So, in the face of powerlessness, we have a choice. And one choice is to accept that we don't have the control we feel like we need.
Mm.
And accepting that often will come with grief. That, I'm aware that I don't have control because what I want to happen isn't happening.
Absolutely.
And I ask for it and I demand it and I beg and it's still not happening. And so I know I don't have control. Well, very deep inside of us, there's a fear there that begins to grow. And we can, by accepting the powerlessness, face that fear and go, I'm afraid to be hurt. I'm afraid to feel abandonment like I did when I was 4. I'm afraid to be wrong. I'm afraid that this happened because of me. And so we've got childhood issues that are adding a multiplier to an adult situation.
Absolutely.
And I don't want to face those things. And so I have options. One of them is manipulation. And I can go about that in a few different ways. For example, I can corner the person. I can get them to say, excuse me, let me back up. I can, once I've asked, try to manipulate by being seductive or possibly by withholding sex, withholding affection, becoming cold, shutting down, in the hope that that will draw them closer to me to do what I want them to do.
Right.
Because I've already asked and I didn't get it. I have it accepted that I didn't get it for a reason.
Hmm. And that is not saying, I want to be real clear for you betrayeds that are listening, that is not saying, well, you didn't get it for a reason because you were bitchy or moody or cranky or this or that. We're not saying that whatsoever. No. We're saying we didn't get it for a reason because...
Well, we didn't. The reason could be that the unfaithful spouse is so full of shame and guilt that they fear exposure and vulnerability in that moment too. Or they feel so terrible about themselves that the idea that somebody would want their affection or want their connection or their concern just is unconscionable.
Or they have so much resentment towards their spouse that they can't get over that, right? It could be a number of different reasons that are not the betrayed's fault per se. We're just identifying the concept of powerlessness. So, okay, keep going. It's riveting.
Well, so manipulating in a variety of different ways is designed to draw them closer, to use kind of disingenuous influence, like to want you to come closer to me, but what I demonstrate is distance and coldness. Doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio there, that if right. I'm distant from you, then you're going to draw towards me instead of saying, I want you to come closer. And if you're not coming closer, What's leading you to not come closer? There could be an intimacy that happens. Like, I've asked for this, I need it, I want it. What is causing this problem that you can't come closer to me when I ask? That you can't be more affectionate, that you can't be kinder? What's happening inside of you, or what am I doing? It could be a discussion that could resolve some problems or some conflicts that are not fully on the surface. Another way I can do it, though, is I can go to our friends and try to gain influence by either shaming you publicly or calling your family and saying you're being a jerk. Can you talk to your kid? Can you talk to your brother?
Right.
And try to get influence that way. But again, I have sidestepped the real issue in that you and I can't have a conversation about what's wrong that is productive. And I don't have the control. I am powerless over making that conversation productive. And so in the face of powerlessness, if we are able to look at our lack of control and accept it, then we don't have to engage in all these other behaviors that could be very manipulative. We could, for example, begin to create double binds for our spouse. For example, let's say you withheld disclosure, but you finally did it, but you weren't really connected or involved. You seem distant. I don't really believe you, but you said it. So since you said it in this kind of, correctness kind of legalism, I'm going to have to accept it. And after I accept it, I'm going to draw you close so that I can smack you around.
It's absolutely true. We do so many different things. But you said something earlier, is that we are brought to a point of grief, or we can do all these other things. And we hate grief. And we run from grief. If you ever put grief in a title for a podcast or an article, nobody opens it. The open rate is trash because nobody wants to read about grief. But you are someone that has talked with so many people that grief is actually, can I say, a portal, is a portal to safety, to healing. I mean, isn't it true that we have to be able to say, okay, I'm powerless over this, but I'm not powerless over my choices and what I can do, right?
Yeah, see, taking the option of practicing some acceptance of I don't have the control, I don't have the power that I want and I believe I need, we get real, basically, and can grieve that something has happened, that I've lost the influence over my spouse that I believe I should have, that I want to have, that I need to have. And begin to grieve, meaning be sad, allow the pain to happen about the damage that has occurred in me, in my spouse, in the relationship, so that there can be kind of an accounting within myself of what's really wrong. Maybe I'm afraid to apologize. Maybe they are afraid that if they apologize, I won't accept it. Maybe a lot of things, but grief is when you drop your hands and go, I don't want to fight this anymore. I don't want to manipulate it anymore. I can't do anything about it. It's hurting. And I want to do something else. And that's the next thing to do. Once I've accepted it, I'm grieving, I look at what's wrong internally with me. Now, maybe my self-esteem has dropped as a result of the situation. Maybe I've stopped going to the gym. I stopped taking care of myself. Maybe I'm overspending. I'm trying to compensate for what I'm missing in my life in other ways, and begin to take care of ourselves. Put the energy I would put into somebody else treating me well and treat myself well. Putting the time into taking care of myself in the ways that I wish I was being taken care of. And so it becomes productive instead of destructive.
You're absolutely right. You said this also off camera. We talked about how um, powerlessness actually creates the opportunity, or let me say it a better way, embracing powerlessness gives me the opportunity to be authentic
Yes.
with myself.
Mm-hmm.
Unpack that, because that's pretty damn deep.
Well, so we all, for the sake of security, live kind of in a personal fiction of things that are predictable, but we really don't control them. And as a result of that, we have a illusion of control, an illusion of power over people, places, and things that we don't really have. The truth is we're very vulnerable, and we rely on and have to trust in order to get by in life many things and many people. And that's the reality of it. And so when we are accepting powerlessness, when we're accepting the true vulnerability we have in life, we're also acknowledging and can become grateful for all the ways in which we are being cooperated with by others, people in our family, people in society, and maybe recognize what we can do and what we have done that led to maybe arrogance over believing I had control or power that I didn't have, or maybe a false sense of security that was based on the charity of others,
Yeah.
that they've been really tolerating me and I didn't even know it. Um,
Well, and you've taught me a lot about this, which is, would you agree that when we get authentic with ourselves, we move to a place, and I think it is probably one of the biggest breakthroughs for a certain kind of faction of people that have this type of childhood trauma or childhood experience or what have you. When we get authentic with ourselves, there's a point where we eventually transition into a place of authentically being self-compassionate with ourselves. Right? Am I right?
yes, we move from trying to seek and manipulate, cajole, beg the compassion and sensitivity from others that we're wanting, and move towards being compassionate to ourselves. And in doing that, some of the truths about ourselves that we haven't wanted to face, maybe based in trauma, can become clearer. And we can come to accept through being compassionate that we're just human, that we're just as flawed, just as fallible, and also just as awesome in our authenticity as everyone else. Um,
It's
and
a
this can
scary
happen.
thought that it's a scary thought though to come to this place. I think for us to get to that place, it is terrifying to some of us, right?
If
Is it because it means letting go? I keep interrupting you. I'm so sorry, but we approach this more conversational today because we're terrified of letting go, right?
yeah, people ask all the time, and they ask you too, how do I let go of a resentment, for example? How do I let go of the anger or the distrust in my partner? And part of the answer is to ask yourself, what's it doing for you? What is it doing for you to hold on to this resentment? Does it allow you to feel superior or to avoid intimacy that you didn't want in the first place? Um, One of the things that childhood trauma does almost all the time is creates a fear of intimacy and connection, because most childhood trauma occurred because a person either did not protect, betrayed, or hurt the kid. And so we associate pain with vulnerability and intimacy and connection.
Mm.
And we put all of these imaginary controls around our vulnerability. We tell ourselves we have influence or power that we don't have. And we often find someone who does the same thing. And so, for example, two people who have a fear of intimacy get together. One of them is, let's say, a workaholic, and he avoids intimacy, we'll call it a he, through work. And the other avoids intimacy through control. And so the house is perfect, the kids are perfect, there's plenty of money coming in, but both of them are lonely.
Mm.
And they engage in, because we all need intimacy and we all need connection, psychological games with each other to explain why they're lonely. And they'll end up saying, if it weren't for you, if you didn't spend so much money, I wouldn't have to work so hard. Well, if you didn't work so hard, if you weren't gone all the time, I wouldn't feel the need to go shopping.
Mm.
And if both drop this resentment, what they find beneath it is, I'm afraid to have this open and vulnerable conversation with you. And it's not because of you. It's because, one, maybe I don't know how to do it. But also maybe I was betrayed. Maybe my parents got divorced. Maybe I was abandoned by one of my parents. And the idea of intimacy, just like the hot stove, if I really get vulnerable with somebody, I feel the fear of rejection and abandonment again. And so if I allow you in as my spouse and I'm really vulnerable and we're really connected, it's going to scare the hell out of me. And if I don't know where that fear is coming from, if I haven't allowed myself to grieve and acknowledge on the deeper level, I'm afraid of intimacy because I'm afraid of abandonment or rejection, then I'm going to blame my spouse because it's happening in the moment. And that's the person that's there.
Yeah, right in front of them.
And so becoming real with ourselves, becoming more authentic through grief means acknowledging that you're not doing anything that's engendering me to have this feeling. This feeling is coming from something that happened before, and I've always had it. I felt this way before I met you. I felt this way when I was 10 years old, and I've never known how to do this. And I thought this dance that we were playing in our marriage would satisfy me enough. There would be enough intimacy, enough connection, enough security that I would never have to face this.
Right. You said it beautifully. But when two people will do the work, that person can actually be their safe person to process that trauma and that pain with. It takes a lot of work, but they can be that, right?
Yeah, see, the theories that I use to do therapy say that we choose our partner because they're going to bring our stuff out.
Mm.
They're going to bring out our traumas, our resentments, all the things, the work that we need to do in order to be fully who we are. That person is going to bring them out. And the question after that is, will they be able to stay with me during the storm of dealing with it? And if they will, both parties are uniquely qualified because they will have what's called a compatible or complementary issue. Like, I have a fear of intimacy that leads me to do this. I have a fear of intimacy that leads me to do that. And as you were doing this and I was doing that, and kids came along and 15 years down the road, we're lonely and we're resenting each other because we haven't dealt with the issue that brought us together. That initial attraction could be, this person knows how I feel.
Mm.
And they'll understand it. And they do. But we have to get through the damage that we do to each other and ourselves by not grieving the actual pain, the wound that occurred before we even met our spouse.
It's beautifully said, because a great friend of mine says that what we don't process shows up in usually 6 to 12 months when you're dealing with betrayal trauma. So we have so many that are like, well, just going to move on and suck it up, get ready. 6 to 12 or so months, that stuff's coming out, and it may come out through anger, rage, health issues, high blood pressure, addiction, you name it. So for the person that's out there, as we're about to end, is for the person that's out there and they're like, Michael, I hate that you have made me have to turn and face some dark chapters of my life, maybe from childhood, young adulthood. For the man or woman who's sitting here going, oh, I don't want to face what happened to me. What are just a couple of things, or maybe there's just some quick thoughts that you could share with them? I know when I had to share my childhood trauma, I needed safety, I needed vulnerability, but I also needed courage. I had no idea what to do. I just went for it one day. But to the person that's really struggling, or maybe they feel like, it's betrayal trauma, but there's also this other stuff that I haven't processed and now I can't contain it. What would be your final thoughts to them on maybe how to get started, or some steps that they could take, or even just the courage to go, you got to deal with this, because if you don't, it's going to deal with you?
So, great question, actually. Right in line with what I was thinking. One of the things that gets stored if we're dealing with some type of childhood trauma, which I should add, doesn't require dramatic, violent, chaotic craziness.
Right.
Trauma is unprocessed information. And childhood itself is traumatic because kids don't have a very good ability to process. A kid that's supported well can deal with just about anything. But we always, as parents, aren't psychic and don't know exactly what our kids are going through or what they need support with. And our kids sometimes can't tell us. So I'm not throwing parents under the bus, and I'm not saying that everything that happens in adulthood comes because our parents were bad and we, are broke. That is not what I'm saying.
Amen.
However, the thing is, recorded along with the pain or the feelings of abandonment or fear is a feeling of being trapped in it, of being powerless. And so when we come to address our internal issues, one of the things that gets triggered along with it is a feeling that we're powerless over them, that they're bigger than us, that what happened is in the past is more powerful than anything I can do right now. And that feeling is one along with the pain and the fear and everything else that was recorded at the time of childhood. Because we are trapped in our families and we can't change our parents and we can't change the bully that's chasing us down the street. There's a lot of things we can't change. And so it's understandable that feeling trapped or powerless would be recorded in the trauma. And so when we come to confront it, sometimes it seems overwhelming, like we can't deal with it because the powerlessness comes up too. However, because I was powerless in the past does not mean that I am powerless now. As an adult, I have more resources. I have a fully developed prefrontal cortex. I can think and do and feel and process. I have freedom of mobility. I've got money. I've got resources I didn't have. I've got support that I didn't have.
I have agency, is what you're saying.
I have agency, yes. And so all of these forces that I now have get brought to bear on a situation that I couldn't control and couldn't escape when I was a child. And so part of doing it is being able to acknowledge that I don't want to be defined by what happened when I was a kid. And I don't want the coping skills that came from it to dominate my life now, because the coping skills that deal with a traumatic childhood don't always lead to a supportive or successful adulthood. Sometimes they lead to infidelity or addiction or overworking or just loneliness. There's an epidemic of loneliness right now because people are afraid to connect. And all of those fears may have been valid 20 years, 30, 40, 50 years ago. They may have been very valid in your family. But being able to evaluate whether they're valid now means facing the past. And so the next thing would be gentle, be kind with yourself. The compassion that you're seeking from others be able to provide that for yourself. The self-blame, the shame that comes from from childhood trauma, or for betrayal for that matter.
Yeah.
Being able to talk to ourselves like we would somebody we care about, a friend, a loved one.
And
Redirect our thoughts towards things that are going to be productive and helpful. Redirect our
absolutely.
energy towards things that are going to be productive and helpful to ourselves instead of some of the compulsive or combative, even things that we do because we fear we can't deal with what's going on inside of us.
It's beautifully said. I had to learn how to be kind to myself. I didn't even know what that looked like. I didn't even know what that was. I didn't even understand, how do you be kind to yourself, especially when you've blown your life up significantly. And so for those of you that are listening that are like, well, I don't want my unfaithful to be kind to themselves. Well, get ready, because that actually increases the probability of relapse, because shameful people do shameful things. Being self-compassionate as an unfaithful can look like being compassionate with the fact that I have made terrible choices, that I have to own, that I might be able to repair, but I have to admit to. Being
And
Go ahead.
I was just going to dive in. Being self-compassionate from the betrayed spouse's perspective can also mean finding ways to let go of the resentment and the distrust, because those are hurting me often a whole lot more than they're hurting my spouse.
You just had to drop a nuclear bomb right before we say goodbye, didn't you? So for people that, I love you dearly, for people that have listened to you today and have thought, man, this dude is like blowing my mind. I know your caseload is pretty full, but you might have openings from time to time because you're tough to get in to see. But if people want to find out more, if they want to schedule or try and schedule with you, how can they do that?
So look me up, just Google and go to Psychology Today. I've got a profile there and it's got my contact information. You can either send a text or email. Honestly, text is better. I'm more likely to receive a text than an email, and I will get back to you. And if I can't be the one to help, I will do my best to find somebody who can help.
Wonderful. I've enjoyed so much today. It was like having a session all over again, and just kind of providing opportunity for you, the listener or the viewer, to maybe not feel so alone and maybe not feel as crazy as we feel at times, to be able to look at the fact that you might be actually feeling incredibly powerless, but you're not powerless over the choices that you make. And it's hard to get there. So however I can help, you can reach out to me. You can leave a comment here. I'd love for you to like and subscribe, but you can also email me at samshealingpodcast@gmail.com. Michael, thank you so much for coming in. We're going to have you in again real soon to keep this conversation going. So thank you for just being who you are, and thank you for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time on the podcast.
Thanks, Sam.